to talk about a key concept that I introduced called Eco-Apartheid. Then we're going to talk about what Eco-Apartheid looks like in people's everyday lives, particularly in indigenous communities. How does racism penetrate the body, get underneath the skin, and impact health and educational inequality? In other words, what does racism look like in the 21st century? My point of departure is the problem of the 21st century, as I see it, is the problem of climate justice. In particular, the ways in which the climate justice movement is responding to growing racial, gender, and socioeconomic inequality. Right? Long before hurricanes and heat waves and floods, indigenous people from the Amazon to the Arctic, right, from the diabetes deserts that run all the way through the Midwest and the Southwest, right, or the toxic triangle where I do my own work, which runs from Berkeley, California, all the way down through Oakland, across to Bayview-Hunters Point, right? Long before any of these natural disasters, low-income communities and indigenous folks, we knew that there was a health-wealth gap, right? We knew that there were eco-haves and eco-have-nots. We knew that race and class played a role in terms of who gets left behind with respect to housing, healthcare, education, and so on. But what these natural disasters have done is they've blown the lid off of environmental racism and the color-coded ways in which our governments respond to many of our most vulnerable populations. And I start there because even though the climate change is the problem of the 21st century, there is a second climate crisis growing alongside the first with equally devastating effects and similar social origins, right? It is the crisis of our human mobilization. It is the crisis of our human intervention. It is the crisis of our human imagination, and it is the collapse of our educational system. So we have two climate crises happening at the same time, both with devastating consequences for the future of our planet. We have the collapse of our ecological systems, and we have the collapse of our educational systems. But there's not enough people talking about the relationship between the two. There's not enough people talking about how does the environment impact our schools and our school children. So what is eco-apartheid for those of you that haven't heard of it? So the significance of eco-apartheid is threefold. Can I come down here now? I guess half of y'all can't see. I told him I wanted to walk around so he can follow me. All right, so threefold. First, eco-apartheid suggests that environmental bads like toxic waste are in low-income communities or in communities of color, while environmental goods such as whole foods, open space, and parks are in wealthier communities. Is that right or wrong? That's right so far. If it's wrong, just let me know. Two, eco-apartheid is a more powerful definition than environmental racism precisely because it captures inequalities beyond race, including space, place, and waste. For example, the urban grocery gap, the transportation gap, right? Not the same amount of bus lines running through our communities, right? Or the produce gap. We talked about who has access to healthy food and who doesn't have access to healthy food, right? While simultaneously centering race, racism, and their political implications. Third, eco-apartheid captures the political, historical, and spatial dimensions to the reproduction of racial inequality. That is, and this is coming straight from Tim Wise, as all of you know, the history of America is the history of systematic, institutionalized racial privilege for white people and white-looking people, right? Everybody understands that. That is our history. That's something that we need to embrace. So many times when folks of color were passing, right, passing meaning trying to look as white as possible, it wasn't because people of color, indigenous people, it's not because we do not love ourselves. Oftentimes it was because we wanted access to institutional resources and privileges, right? So the history of America is the history of systematic institutionalized racial privilege for white people and white-looking people, whether we are talking about the Naturalization Act, right, of 1790, which gave white folks and only white folks the ability to be free citizens of the United States, or whether we're talking about the Homestead Act, right, which allowed white folks 160 acres of land, okay, for $10, while people of color, black folks in particular, but people of color in general, indigenous folks, we couldn't get 40 acres and a mule, right? Or whether we're talking about federally subsidized, federally underwritten, federally guaranteed FHA loans. On the backs of those loans was the creation of the white middle class, where if we would have done the same thing for black and brown folks, we call it welfare. When we did it for native folks, we call it reservations. But when we did it for white folks, we called it good, sound economic policy, right? The average white family has 20 times the average net worth of the average black family, 18 times the net worth of the average Latino family, 22 times the net worth of Native Americans. And the point is not solely because of hard work, right? Not solely because of better morals, not solely because of better values, right? But because of systematic, institutionalized racial preferences that were passed from one generation to the next. But what about health? What about life expectancy? What about healthy schools and sick schools? What about whole regions of the country, whole regions of the world, right, that are not as healthy as they could be due to the historical and structural factors that I've outlined here for you? Next slide. So what does eco-apartheid look like in the Bay Area? So the red dots here are toxic release inventory facilities, essentially smokestacks, okay? And the gray areas that you see are where people of color live, right? Such that black folks are 3 times more likely, Latinos 2 times more likely, many native folks are like 4 or 5 times more likely in urban areas, right? And Asian Americans 1.5 times more likely to live next to a TRI facility. Next slide. Does anybody know where this is? Richmond, California, right down the street. Yeah, we come over to Marin to do Bioneers, but there's a lot going on right down the street in Richmond, right? And part of what's going on in Richmond in our community are these TRI facilities, this chevron being embedded in our community and pumping out this smoke, right? And a lot of times I have my young people, when I'm teaching, I say, you know, why is this criminal? So folks are worried about gun violence, but the reality is more black and brown and indigenous folks are dying of heart attacks, diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, right, asthma, right, from this kind of toxic situation than we are of gun violence over the long run. Any group, right, white males that are placed in the dominant position but then are attributed a negative stereotype underperform, right? So whatever the group is, again, Claude Steele, stereotype threat, check it out. Whatever the group is that is stigmatized begins to underperform. Next slide. So the final piece of the puzzle here is, what does this do to our life expectancy? Well, it's pretty clear. What this graph is basically saying in a nutshell is that if you live in the Oakland flatlands, right, you will live 10.9 years less than if you live in the Berkeley Hills, right? What would you give for 10.9 more years? If you live in Bayview-Hunters Point in San Francisco, you will live 14.1 years less, right, than if you lived in a wealthier community in San Francisco. Next slide. So we have not, This is the second take-home. The first take-home was eco-apartheid and the idea of cumulative causation. The second take-home is we do not have an achievement gap. Stop using that term. What we have is an opportunity gap. Thank you, thank you. An achievement gap implies inequalities based on cultural or genetic difference. An opportunity gap remaps these inequities onto existing structural conditions. So what can be done? What can we do about this?